Okay, welcome. We'll look at a quick introduction to one of your sketch exercises dealing with understanding section. And one way we'll do that is a little hands-on application. This is a pepper. It's organic. It's good for you. I use it to make some lunch a little bit later. And there's a few ways you can cut it. Depends on where you are and what you have access to. Right? If you're in the studio and you've got your Olfa knife, we can do it with this. You might want a few paper towels handy to clean this off so it doesn't rust or get dull on you. And you'll be a little bit careful because you'll be using a long portion of the blade. So you might need to put a new one in to do this. That works pretty well. We've done it for years in the studio environment. Or you can use this if you're at home, right? A large chef's knife or something, or a small paring knife, which is really what's much more made for cutting something like this pepper. But you might not have that in the studio, and you don't really need to have it around. So keep that in mind if you're at home. You might have access to tools that are a little more suited for this. You don't want to get this wet all the time. But I'll use this since that's what everyone has. Now, against my advice earlier in the safety video, we're going to put this knife blade out pretty far for this purpose of cutting. But first, let's cover the pepper a little bit and what section is. So what we're talking about here is exploring the pepper and kind of thinking or imagining what direction it might be interesting to cut it to understand what's happening within a plane of cut inside there. So that's why the chef's knife is the knife metaphor. Way to think about it is you're really just slicing through this. It's called a section cut in architecture, but we do it all the time when we're making dinner or something like that. We can do it in this direction, we can do it in this direction, we can do it in this direction. Doesn't matter. All we want to make sure we do is that it's a planar cut. And this, we have to be a little more careful when we do that to make sure we go pretty straight through. If you're a little off, in this case, it's okay. We're dealing with some material dimensions. But if we were doing it for, say, a model or a piece of architectural work, we might use a saw so we can go straight through on the bandsaw. One thing you can do with this is if you have a Sharpie or a marker around, you can try to kind of mark it. But I think I'm going to go and just try to push straight through with this. If I bring this out, I've done a lot of these. I think any direction you cut it gets pretty interesting. You might have to have a few peppers around to explore a few different things, but I'll start with a very traditional cut. Now, keep in mind it's going to probably get your cutting mat a little wet from the water inside the pepper, and there's going to be some seeds. So you might put down some paper towel. It won't hurt anything here. You just got to remember to clean it up so it doesn't get sticky or get on other models that you're making. But like this, with my hands safely back, I'm just going to do a straight through the middle cut and try to go straight down as possible. If you're up above it and you can see your cutting mat, probably don't want to do a drag through because it's going to be too big for the model, but you can at least use some of these lines as a guide. I'm a little bit off to the side, so I'm going to have to do my best. And these knives are pretty sharp, but they're dealing with a material they're not used to cutting. So just be careful, go slow, and have your fingers well out of the way. And there we go. Right, if I needed a little bit more, I could put a new blade on here if my pepper was bigger. But that looks like a pretty good plane of cut. All right, if I were to put a piece of glass here on both sides, it would fit perfectly. And I'm getting kind of an X-ray vision into what's going on inside this pepper, both in the space of the pepper as well as in the wall of the pepper. There's a lot of things we can start to examine here and really get into. Right, we have a thicker, darker color outer edge, the skin. Right, it's a little tougher, it protects the pepper. We have like a gradient of cells opening up to the inside, and maybe on this one we can see a little more. You can really start to see how those cells, which are just kind of sacs of water and nutrients, are coming together to hold energy to keep this pepper as a storage device for when these seeds are ready, and also encourage other things to come and eat it, so they spread these seeds around for the next season or the next growing cycle. Do we need to know all that about the pepper to sketch it? Maybe not, but I think that's what you want to do when you're kind of examining something and using section as an invasive and analytical device to really understand it. We can also see that you've got these other membranes that have a bit of a different texture and kind of a line where they change position. So that's interesting, something we'll have to think about in our sketch, as well as all these like seeds and other little things in the back. Now when we talk about section, the thing you really want to focus on is if I were to take that plane of glass and put it on there, and only what touches the glass, right? So only the stuff the knife cut is the primary focus of our section. Now, while we can see the rest of that back there, we see it in a perspective that causes some diminishing and some bending of the light, which then can be difficult to represent architecturally and abstractly. So what we want to do is first try to capture that inner and outer dimension. And that's really what we might talk about in a building where we have an outside and an inside made of spaces and some walls or floors separating them. If you want to do it super accurately and translate it, there's a couple of ways you can do that. I'll grab a piece of scrap paper here, just put it down. So one thing we could do is kind of take it, put it on there. Because it's a pepper and it's wet, this might be enough to get it on its own. Well, not fully, but it's kind of like a stamp, and it's pretty close. I'll never be able to get that in the same place. So let's do another one. Then we can grab our pencil, trace around the edge. Now this isn't the right way or the wrong way to kind of understand it and work with your sketch, but it's one way to consider working with it. Now I get a little bit of that, but I don't get everything, and so I can't complete it entirely as a trace because there's no way for me to get to the inside. You might get clever and you could cut again and have that so you could trace it. That's a way to do it pretty accurately if you have infinite dissection capabilities. And there's plenty of other ways to do this by finding key points of measurement, right? So we can line up that there's this little dent here, and that pretty much goes straight out to the tip of this thing, and I can actually measure that and find that same condition down here. So look at that, right? That's going to be over here. You can find that point, and maybe I get lucky and a little bit of this comes in, or I can get it wet again. Kind of identify it out here and find each one of these points where the dent happens. And then use my ruler to measure them and get an accurate dimension in there. I'll just do a quick one, 2 centimeters. That might be about right. But the goal here is to be accurate, not overly worried. So we're using our sketch capabilities, maybe holding it in the same direction helps. And just trying to follow the curves. Remembering what you learned from the blind contour can be helpful here. It's a little like reversed when I'm doing it this way, and so that can be confusing. So I'm gonna stop with this method, because that's not what we're really trying to do. What we want to do is learn to observe and sketch. So instead, I'm going to put this here so I can look at it and try to sketch it out accurately. Again, starting like the blind contour, just follow the edge slowly, try to mimic what I see as far as curvature, flexions, bumps, whatever details are interesting to me. Scale and size. It's probably not going to be 100% accurate. But then again, every pepper is different anyway, so we're just trying to gain some understanding of this by seeing it in section and sketching it into a new medium. Alright, it's getting there. It's a little small. That's generally okay. Now I can do the same thing for the interior, knowing that most of this is an offset, except for these little tonsil things that come out. And then we got some fun stuff going on in there. Now, I'm not drawing any of the seeds that are in the background or any of this stuff back here. I'm just really focusing on that cut plane. So that's what we want to learn to see. It's kind of one of architecture's superpowers that you're going to be learning about during this segment of working in section, is to be able to see in this abstract way what's going on inside of something, specifically a building. This is interesting here because it's almost straight with a little curve on both sides. It's almost mechanical. It's pretty neat. That's not so bad. Right, there's probably some measurement issues. This one down here didn't quite get the shape as nice as it could have. Alright, and this is just like a nice exercise too in doing something with a little different type of geometry. These like organic curves than you've been doing so far with all the cubes, so you get a chance to exercise kind of a different part of your brain and come back through because it's a sketch and clean things up. And I'll maybe get a few of the properties in there. And I know that this kind of continues here, has a light line. It's, a little chunkier and wobblier here, but has generally a clear pattern to it. Maybe if I look a little closer, I'll kind of understand what that is. Really observe it. And then I know that like this outer edge is pretty heavy, so I'll come back, really thicken that up. Trying to get out of the habit, if you're doing this, of like roughing it in. Right? This type of stuff is kind of how we start sketching and start drawing, because it makes us feel like we're getting more accurate. What you want to kind of get in the habit of is, even if they're shorter runs, try not to overlap too much and just make the curve, or just make the line. Right? That line's not perfect and straight, but it's not like this either. We want to like do these here, where we get in the habit of just making the curve. So I'm going to try to do that in segments along here. But you might lightly do some of the roughing in beforehand. That seems pretty good. So now you might ask, once I have that in place, I want this line to be a little wobblier anyway. You can start to do some other stuff. I might come through and do a little careful hatching here, where every line is parallel, and it goes in the same direction, same distance from each other, as much as possible in sketch mode. Now if we're doing this as a drafting thing, we'd be really precise. Let's get as much as we can. Trying to make sure they line up all the way across here. I don't think I'm doing a great job. I'll kind of correct myself as I go. Try not to do too much with the wrist, more with the arm, because you'll get less fluctuation. What I'm really wanting to do is communicate with my sketch that there's something different about that ring and these internal ones. And the way I do that could be done differently. I could just change the direction of my hatch, maybe the intensity of the pressure. So it's not representational in the sense of looking exactly like that membrane, but it's denoting that there's a difference, and maybe that difference is important because these have very different material properties, visual properties. So that's looking pretty good. I like the sketch. And so you do several of those, cutting in different directions, maybe thinking about how you could do both side by side, so you unfold it for us to really explore it. Where is that moment of unfolding? Could be kind of nice there, right? And then, after you have that in place and do a few of them, try a few different cuts. I think now that this is cut this way, we could say, let's try to connect two of these membrane lobes. And these knives are nice and sharp, so you can get quite a lot of accuracy. I just need a little more length. I like dissecting something in biology class. This one you can eat later, and so it's not as wasteful, but I did a pretty good job. Now this is, in architecture, a bit of a weird section to take, because this thing, if I cut through it, is really thick, but I'm hiding a lot of other stuff. So I might, in architecture, more want one that only goes through something of a consistent dimension, not here. And we'll talk about more of that. Let's say if this is similar to a building or a room, this cut would have been a plan. So it shows these as walls, and you don't want to cut a section, which is a vertical cut, through a wall. You want to cut a section, well, through exterior walls, not through walls parallel to the cutting plane, because then when I read this, I don't know if that's just a solid piece of pepper or if that's a millimeter thick wall. So that's something you'll see in buildings. They rarely cut through something like this unless it's kind of part of the rest of the building and they're focusing somewhere else. Because it's a little bit unclear what that is communicating, and we'd have to use a hidden line to show there's something back there, and we don't see the space, and what sections really want to show us is space. Now, if this was a plan, we'd be kind of cutting through a floor, right? And that's also a little bit weird because we can't see through it, we can't see below it, so we'd want to cut either just below the floor or just above the floor as a way to see that. And I'll cut this one again as an example. And this is something you can explore, cut up. Right, so if that was a building, and this is my plan cut, I took away the top, so I cut it and I want to see inside. Oops. Cut that, removed it, set it aside, looking straight down. Now I can see the wall and the floor here, and there's stuff below, but that's not the important part of this cut. I really want to understand the relationship of the wall, probably the rest of the space, and the floor. So that's something to start to look for in this. But there's the beginning of cutting a pepper. Again, be careful with this knife way out. Now it's going to be all wet. You don't want to put it back in. So you want to get some paper towel here and dry it off. It's going to corrode, probably, but it still should be good for a while for cutting with. You get it nice and dry right away and don't leave it there too long. Your knife blades usually come with a lot of lubricant in the package. So you might take some of that and rub it back on there. I'm just going to slide this one back in, make sure it's not got any resistance there, and close it up. And that should be cutting a pepper and starting to sketch it in section plan to explore the spatial opportunity of inside and outside.